Okay, normally I talk about keys to the kingdom, and today I'm talking about kingdom is the key. And the reason that I put it in this perspective is because to understand the Gospels, you have to understand that there's the primary subject of interest in the Gospels coming from the writers themselves and coming from Jesus is the kingdom of God. That's the primary idea, that the kingdom of God it's the subject. And what is that? What is the kingdom of God? The definition for this will help us sort out what is produced by the early church and what Jesus probably taught. It's one of the ways to help us figure that out. And as I am writing my book, I'm going to give, and over the next several weeks also here, I'm going to give some key principles to look for, some key ideas to look for that'll help us determine whether we're reading the voice or hearing the voice of the gospel writer, the evangelist, or we're hearing the voice of Jesus. And it pretty much comes down to what they mean by the kingdom of God. And we think we know what that is. You know, we're pretty steeped in that idea. If you would ask the question today of any mainstream Christian, when is the kingdom coming? They would say they don't know when it's coming. Nobody knows when it's coming. If you would ask them to describe it, they would probably describe some major changes in the political landscape, in the social landscape, in the landscape of the world as in general, our whole society. Because what we think of as the coming kingdom and coming, it's not here yet. Something's going to change. So is that what Jesus taught? From Luke we have this statement, and this I think is a surviving part of the mystical thread that I talk about. And if you don't like the word mystical, some people don't, just replace that with spiritual thread, a deeper meaning. I like mystical, and I'll explain why. Being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God was coming, he answered them, "The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed, nor will they say, 'Lo, here it is,' or 'there.' For behold, the kingdom of God is within you." I think that is about as close to a pure statement of Jesus as we could probably get. And if you are asking yourself, what does he mean by this? What is the kingdom? You got two things going on here. Being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God is coming, they are believing that the kingdom is not here yet. But Jesus is saying something very different. It is here, and it's centered within you. That is the voice of the mystic. You can take any mystical tradition, I don't care if it's East or West, and they hold that same principle, that God is everywhere present, but centered in you, centered in every person. That's why I like the mystical tradition. There's a lot of misunderstanding around the use of that term. It's magical, it's mysterious, but it's not any of these things. Although there's not a great deal of understanding about this inner kingdom and what Jesus means here, and this saying seems totally out of place when you think of the context of the Gospels, who are waiting and predicting for this coming kingdom. This statement makes no sense. And my theory on that is the writers had access to lists of sayings from Jesus, and they didn't want to get rid of any of them. They wanted to use all of them. So they try to figure out how to stick them in their narrative. And actually, if you look up this, Luke 17:20 through 21, written about 85 Common Era AD, you could actually remove that statement, and it doesn't interfere with the flow of the narrative at all. And that tells scholars that this was probably a statement that was floating around independently, not in a particular list. And Luke is actually the only one that uses it here. But somebody else uses it also, and that is the Gospel of Thomas. And there are a group of scholars that believe Thomas, the earliest version of the Gospel of Thomas, which is not in the Bible, is dated between 50 and 60 Common Era, or AD. And that is about the same time Mark, the first Gospel, came out. And it's actually the 50 to 60 CE is the era that Paul wrote in. He wrote about 50 to 53. So he was active writing there. But this is almost identical to the Gospel of Luke. His disciples said to him, it's disciples rather than Pharisees in this case, when will the kingdom come? Same question. It will not come by watching for it. It will not be said, look here or look there. Rather, the Father's kingdom is spread out upon the earth and people don't see it. So from Luke, it's within, and Thomas is saying it's everywhere. It's spread out upon the earth. And both of these are true, and both of these are probably what Jesus taught. That there's no place you can go, there's no place you can be where God is not. That God is omnipresent. And that is actually an ancient concept. It goes back, well, we don't know how far it goes back in the Jewish literature, but it is, it's not the Orthodox view. It is more the Jewish mysticism, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. But you've got these two sayings, and they're several years apart in their production, even if Thomas came along later, as some scholars think it did. None of Thomas was used in the four Gospels. And that is very curious, because some of these sayings are almost identical, just like this one. It's a pretty good match, but there are several others that match up. So how did these sayings arise, on their own, independent of one another? And that would tell us, too, that there was a message floating around, probably directly from Jesus, that did not necessarily fit the developed church narrative, but they were preserved. And the gospel, or the Gnostic writers, and Thomas is part of a group of Gnostic writings, but he's not exactly Gnostic. Thomas, the author of this, is supposed to be the twin brother of Jesus. And that's, up for grabs. Twin brother would mean that the virgin story is not quite accurate to have a twin. But that's one of the traditions that's circulated for a long time. But this, the Gnostics had a very different view of Jesus. They did not even see him in some cases. There were several strands of Gnosticism. And one of the strands didn't think Jesus was a human being, thought he was a spiritual being. And in some of the Gospels, Gnostic Gospels that were discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, Jesus will be talking to the disciples and saying, the thing you saw on the cross was not me. And he says, I stood back laughing as I observed this. They thought they got me. And this is the view of the Gnostic back in those early days, first, second centuries. But the Gnostic believed that God was this big spark of light way off in the universe someplace. And God was shooting off sparks. And as these sparks would fly through the air, the archons, which or the planets would capture these sparks and embody them, put them in a physical body, and put them on Earth. So the ones that were captured in bodies had this divine spark. So they viewed Jesus as one who, but they got lost in the body. They got lost in the material experience. So they forgot about the divine spark. So Jesus comes along. He's also a divine spark, and he's embodied, but he doesn't forget. He remembers that his source is God. And he is the great Redeemer in their thinking. He comes to remind those who have the spark, they've got it. And that's what salvation is about. And it's a progressive thing. You heard the phrase seventh heaven. It comes from Gnosticism. They believed in reincarnation, that you would come back and you would evolve to higher levels, higher heavenly levels. But they believed that. That's how they treated Jesus. They saw him as the Redeemer, and they did not put any emphasis on his death. And while they were in play, while they existed, the traditional Christian, the more traditional, more orthodox Christian, they were under persecution. And the Romans were not persecuting the Gnostics. And this made the regular Christians very angry, because they were dying for their faith. All you had to do is say, I'm a Christian, and you'd be put to death in a certain period. The Gnostics were saying that your martyrdom is a waste of life. Jesus already died for us. There's no need to do it again, for you to go through it. But the Christian martyrs were holding this up as a banner, and they were actually inviting death, inviting themselves to be put into the arenas and nailed to crosses and all these horrible things that were done to them. And the early leaders of the Christian movement that became the formal Christian movement absolutely hated the Gnostics. They thought they were totally cowards for not professing the things that would get them killed. So we ought to be happy we didn't live in that time. It was a very horrible time to live. But the Christian martyrs hated the Gnostics, and that's why we didn't hear anything about them until 1945. Because they totally suppressed their writings. There were several Gnostic teachers that were famous in the region in the day. And these people, when they would write about them, they wrote worse things about them than they did the people who were disemboweling them and feeding them to the lions and doing the horrible stuff they were doing. It was like the ones that were doing that, they were seen as their saviors. It's a blessing to be martyred. But they absolutely hated the Gnostics, and that's why we have not heard anything about them. But now we have a whole treasure trove of books, and they are strange. Some of them are very strange. But the point here is there's not just one Christianity floating around, not even in the more traditional sense. There are many ways of viewing that, and some of the older sources. And, the Romans hated the Christians as well. They believed that Jesus taught you should eat human flesh and drink human blood. You know that story. They actually believe that. You can find letters from Roman officials saying these people are cannibals and they deserve to die. They just despise them. And they believe in magic. They believe in this magic, this great magician that was put to death. They still think he's got some kind of magic. And the Christian movement kept growing. But the early leaders made sure that the death and resurrection of Jesus was the teaching, and the Gnostics kind of blew a hole in that theory, and that's why they hated them. They were going against what they were pushing. So these two passages, separated by time and space, depict a kingdom of God that cannot be observed. Mainstream Christianity and the gospel writers in general adopted the notion of an observable kingdom. Jesus was speaking of the kingdom as a spiritual dimension that cannot be seen with the physical eye, nor is there adequate language to describe it, which is no doubt why he employed parables. See, a lot of things will make sense when you think about it from this perspective. Why did he speak in parables? I think it's either Luke or Matthew that says he did it to confuse people. He did it to confuse the people who would not be saved. Well, that makes no sense. I've been a spiritual teacher for 40-some years, and it's very important for me to communicate the principles I'm trying to teach, and I cannot imagine Jesus going out and trying to confuse everybody. But that's the reason he spoke in parables, is because there's no language to describe this unseen dimension. You're saying the kingdom of God is spread out upon the earth and people do not see it. Well, how do you describe that? If it's within you, well, how do you describe that? It's very interesting that William James, who was a noted psychologist, came along later, 1842, 1910, wrote the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. He talked about the mystical experience. He said the mystical experience defies expression, that no adequate report of its contents can be given in words. Its quality must be directly experienced. It cannot be imparted or transferred to others. Mystical states are more like states of feeling than like states of intellect. No one can make clear to another who has never had a certain feeling in what the quality or worth of it consists. So that's why Jesus spoke in parables. He'll always say the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he'll follow it with some descriptive a story or something. Well, the gospel writers would take that story and translate that into a physical coming kingdom where there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth, the end times. So you can always tell when it's the voice of the author, of the gospel writer, when we're talking about something coming. Because if Jesus was saying the kingdom is here, it's spread out upon the earth and people don't see it, or it's within you, then the question of when is it coming is answered. It's already here. It's not coming. It's already here. And what the early Christian church is doing, all they did was adopt the ancient Jewish expectation of a coming Messiah. But when Jesus came around, there was something about him that got their attention, and they began to say he was the Messiah. But as I said last week, very few people believed that in the beginning. Very few Jews believed that. Jesus was a Jew, was always a Jew, never proclaimed to be anything other than. Never portrayed himself as starting something new. There's a line that says, I didn't come to break the law, I came to fulfill it. And I think that's exactly what he's doing, or what he did in his life. Evelyn Underhill, who's also a noted author on the subject of mysticism, says the mystical experience represents a plane of perception for which human speech has few equivalents. So we have to speak in simile and parable and metaphor to describe it. It's like something, it's like a seed. It's the smallest of all seeds, but you plant it, it grows into the largest. That makes perfect sense to me when you think of the awareness. You think of that seed as the awareness of this inner presence. It's passed on to us perhaps as an idea or something we read in a book, and it begins to unfold to where we understand that Nothing new has to happen here. When is the universe going to start working properly? That's another way to look at it. It works properly. It's been working properly. That would be like saying, when is the kingdom going to come? When is God going to show up? Jesus said, it's already happened. It can't be otherwise. The Gospel of Mark, the first one written, was written under horrific conditions. People were being put to death. Jerusalem was under siege. The temple was burned to the ground. And for the Jew, that was the worst thing that could possibly happen. And so the idea of a coming kingdom would have been a lot more important to pass on to people. We're under severe attack right now. But this thing's going to happen. Something better is going to happen. And by the time Jesus comes around, you see, the Gospel of Mark was not written until about 40 years after the death of Jesus. Just think about that. 40 years ago. And in that period of time, people would gather in their homes and they would talk about their understanding of who he was or who they thought he was. They would quote scriptures. They would probably sing hymns. Paul points out in his letter to the Philippians, there's a section that scholars think is a hymn that maybe they would sing about his life and death. But they would get together and they, for 40 years, passed on through oral tradition. This tradition began to build and it began to become a story. And by the time Mark wrote, he probably had that story. And he simply put it on paper. As I have suggested, I think this was probably a collective endeavor. Not someone just sitting down, in the dark of night by a lantern and writing down this story. This all developed as a collective effort. People would get together. When I have a funeral service, we will have an obituary. And that's kind of the history. That's kind of it's a biography. It's a very brief points of information about that individual. But then I'll invite people to get up and talk about their experience with that person. And you get a whole different view. So you can imagine people getting together talking about Jesus, and then over a meal, we'll go down and have maybe a reception afterward, and that conversation continues. It's more informal. But that is how the story, the gospel, the good news was carried. It was by word of mouth, and it was by people sharing not necessarily their first-hand experience, although some of them may have had early as they began to meet. Some of them could have been eyewitnesses. But 40 years, a lot of them would die. I've been doing ministry for 40 years, 40 plus years, and a lot of the people I knew in the very early years are gone. We've seen people here, just a lot of them gone. So you would not have a lot of the original people left. The story would be developed, and it's not unusual. There are cultures, many cultures around the world that do not have a written, or did not have a written language. They carried on their history through dance, through song, through myth, through poetry, through all kinds of ways where it was all verbal or physical. But to think that would be impossible for that story to be passed on is, there are a lot of precedents for it. Well, we know it was because that's how it happened. There was no writing prior to this. The Gospels, Mark was the first written gospel. Paul's letters were the first written documents, and began in 51 or so A.D. Okay, so why would Jesus be talking about an inner kingdom? And I think there's a very good chance that he was exposed to the Kabbalah, to Jewish mysticism. I was looking that up this week, and in Wikipedia it draws from the Jewish Encyclopedia. It says, Jewish Kabbalah is a set of esoteric teachings meant to explain the relationship between the unchanging eternal God, the mysterious Ein Sof, I don't know how to pronounce that, the infinite, and the mortal finite universe. Isn't that what we are doing? Isn't that what we do? We're trying to explain the difference or the relationship between the whole unseen reality that we call God. It forms the foundation of mystical religious interpretations within Judaism. And then for a few centuries, the esoteric knowledge was referred to by its aspect practice, meditation, translated as being alone or isolating oneself. What did Jesus tell us to do when we prayed? To isolate yourself. Go into your room, shut the door. And it said often of Jesus, he would go alone to a lonely place. He would go off to a lonely place and pray. And I'm not trying to prove a point here. Some people believe he went to India, and that's possible, but there's no evidence in the Gospels that he did. There are people in his region that did, though. That is a known fact. Apollonius was a contemporary of his. He was also a mystic, and he traveled to Egypt or to India. So it would not be impossible, and there's a trail of evidence that people use, and it's very interesting, I think, and it's worth exploring. But the Gospels themselves don't give any indication of that, and they don't give any indication of what I'm saying right now. The indication that I get is that the Kabbalah is mysticism. Could Jesus have been exposed to it? Absolutely. Because how long has it been around? They say they trace it back to Adam, the very beginning. That there was always this mystical element of Judaism. And from the things that we're going to be looking at that come out of the sayings of Jesus, it is definitely a mystical message, mystical thread. But he was not exposed, or there's no evidence he was exposed to the Essenes either. And they were sort of mystical, but they were more apocalyptic. That is, they were definitely waiting for the end times. And by the end times, we don't mean the end of the world. We mean the end of Roman domination or anybody's domination. The Essenes moved out to the desert because they thought the temple was absolutely corrupt. And it was. Become full of the money changers, and there was a hierarchy within the temple that had to appease Rome. So they had 1 foot in this door and 1 foot or this room and 1 foot in the other room, 1 foot in getting along with the Romans and the other pleasing the Jews. So when a person like Jesus would see the temple and see this going on, he would consider that absolutely corrupt. Well, the Essenes, no question about it, absolute corruption in their minds. So they move out to the desert to get away from all of that. And they became the children of light. The children of darkness were those Jews and those Romans and everybody else. And one day we're going to see this great holy war, and we're going to win, and we're going to live happily ever after. Right here, I mean, they would probably have envisioned moving back into Jerusalem and thought that was the signal. It's time to go, time to get them. They attacked the Romans and they were completely annihilated. So that didn't work out so well. But and John the Baptist is kind of one of them. When you see him, and the gospel writers connect John the Baptist not to the Essenes but to Jesus, like he's the one that prepares the way. Well, the writers were probably doing that out of courtesy to the followers of John that were still around, a way to try to draw them in, saying John was important too. But there's no evidence that Jesus pursued the teachings of John, only that he was baptized by him. And historically speaking, we don't really know if that's even true. That could be a total invention of the gospel writers, to make that tie, to tell the followers of John, you're welcome too. You're welcome in our group as well. There's just a lot of things like this that if you don't ever delve into critical scholarship, you'll never get it. And I understand why people don't, because there's just a mass of information, and it's hard to take it all in. But it's totally fascinating. When will the kingdom come? Over 2,000 years. Think about this, and I do think about this quite a bit. 2,000 years have passed since the death of Jesus, and still he has not returned to usher in the expected kingdom. Why? Because this is not the nature of the kingdom of which he spoke. That's my absolute conviction, that the Gospels teach it, the Gospel writers teach it, but Jesus did not. Otherwise, I think he'd be back by now. Jesus' kingdom of God is intuitively experienced in moments of quiet receptivity. As we become aware of God as an inner presence, we then begin to see that this kingdom is also spread out upon the earth. And see, this goes way back into Psalms. You're all familiar with this, I'm sure. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, or Sheol, as one version says, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. He's speaking of omnipresence. No matter where you go, the kingdom of God is spread out upon the earth. That's what he's saying. Exactly the same thing, but in a very poetic way. So the question is, okay, if we can make this distinction between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the church, the early church and current church, what would it have been about the teachings of Jesus that would have made people follow him? That's the question. What was he teaching that the common person responded to? And that's the question I want to answer over the next several weeks, because it's the practical side. He talked about the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, how they're cared for. Why do you worry so much? He's asking. There's a principle of life working through all of us. I was talking to somebody recently that was going through something, and we want to know, how do we apply these principles to what we're going through? And I think that Jesus did that very thing, that when he was talking about the kingdom of God, he's talking about a living principle that's working through us, that just like the birds of the air and the lilies of the field knows how to direct us to the answers we need. And I think that's why people followed him. It was a form of Judaism, and most people probably could not understand the Kabbalah. I don't delve into it because it's very complicated. But I think Jesus was able to take the essence of it, of that teaching, the Jewish mysticism, and translate it into something practical people could apply to their daily life. I think that's what made him popular. And that got lost in the war, the Jewish revolt. I also want to make a correction. I said the Masada was the culmination of the Second Jewish War. It was the culmination of the sacking of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. It was the earliest part, and I tried to correct that online, but I could only do it in the show notes. But anyway, that's the direction I want to go over the next several weeks. We're going to look at each of these parables and learn how to take out, peel away the onion skin, of the later teaching, and try to find that kernel of truth that Jesus imparted. And it's not that hard when you have those keys. All right. Thanks for coming out. cast your bread upon the living waters. Stand in faith as you watch it drift away. Learn to trust that mighty cosmic ocean, and it will bring back your cherished dreams someday. There will be times as you wait upon the shoreline that your hopes will all crumble in the sand. You want to cling to all of your possessions, but this is when you must open up your hand and cast your bread upon the living waters. Stand in faith as you watch it drift away. Learn to trust that mighty cosmic ocean, and it will bring back your cherished dreams someday. There is a reason that you dream, that you reach for something more, that you have the power to see another distant shore. You are destined to go forth, born to sail the mighty sea, explore the unknown world and be free. So cast your bread upon the living waters. Stand in faith as you watch it drift away. Learn to trust that mighty cosmic ocean. It will bring back your cherished dreams someday. Yes, it will bring back your cherished dreams someday.
You've been watching a talk given by Reverend Doug Bottorff here at Independent Unity in beautiful Grand Junction, Colorado. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really helps us spread our message. If you would like to support us, you can do so by clicking the button in the right-hand corner of the video screen. We greatly appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching.